I should get her back. I am so excited to talk to you guys tonight, even though I cannot see you because of my lights here. You guys are some of my favorite leaders to be able to get to speak to tonight, and I'm pretty sure that you might even have a little bit of a competition for which group of you struggle with boundaries more. But the truth is, every single one of us struggles with boundaries. And the reason I know this is because the very first time I gave this talk was in 2005, 12 years ago, at a group life conference, and they keep asking me to come back and do this talk. So that tells me we still have problems with boundaries, and we still have people violating our boundaries, right? So I'm really excited to talk about this because I really think if you can implement some of these truths, you can really have immense freedom in your life and respect from others, and who doesn't want that? So let's figure out, do you guys have some boundary issues? Are you in the right spot? Are you listening for the right reasons? Have you ever been on the phone with someone that's going on and on and on, and a family member or a friend is looking at you like you've been on the phone for hours? Do any of you have a family member that has asked you to borrow money? Or better yet, keep the money, not even borrow it? How about those of you that have family members who do not handle their anger productively? Anybody have that in their family? Or better yet, meddles in your parenting. Those are fun. Are some of you so busy going from one activity to the next that you can't even catch your breath? I'm sure we've got some of those. Do any of you ever feel like you can't satisfy anyone, or that you're unappreciated or disrespected? Have any of you been taken advantage of or felt manipulated? If you can say yes to any of those statements, more than likely you have some boundary issues. Either you have them personally or somebody else is really trying hard to meddle with your boundaries or violate your boundaries. I'm really excited because you guys filled out a survey for this talk, and I read through every single one of those surveys, and it's amazing what some of you are going through, what some of you are experiencing with boundaries or lack of boundaries, and so forth and so on. So I think we've got some good nuggets for you today. Without boundaries, we would have chaos in this world. Stop signs, fences, doors with locks. They all keep chaos out of our worlds. Well, personal boundaries do the same thing. They keep chaos out of our internal worlds. And depression and anxiety and resentment, even hatred for others, can result from you not setting good boundaries. But where do we start? Tonight we're going to answer questions like, how much should I help someone? How can I set limits and still be a loving person? Can I say no to others? How can I set boundaries without feeling guilty? What do I do if others do not respect or, in fact, violate my boundaries? Well, many of you might be wondering, what in the world is a boundary? And all of you had different definitions, so that was kind of fun. Boundaries are personal property lines. They are where I end and you begin. It's like a fence around you with a gate. Think about a personal property line around you. That's what a boundary is. And we've got a great definition for you in your handout that I really liked. They are guidelines, rules, or limits a person creates for what are reasonable, safe, and permissible ways for others to behave around us, and how we will respond when someone steps outside of those limits. Boundaries determine what is me and what is not me, what is mine to own and what is not mine to own as far as choices, behaviors, emotions. But this is going to be the most critical thing I say. Boundaries are for you. We don't set boundaries for other people. And I bet that's amazing to some of you because in what you wrote in your survey, it showed that many of you think that you set boundaries for other people. We cannot make anybody do anything. We kind of wish we could, right? And it'd be so much more fun to set boundaries for other people than to have to set them for ourselves. But really, boundaries are for you. Every person is an owner of their boundaries or personal property lines. And if I don't have a clear sense of what's my property and what's my neighbor's property, I might think that I need to help my neighbor take care of their property, even to the point of neglecting my own property. And how this works is it's kind of like if I'm watering my own lawn, but my sprinkler is pointed over to my neighbor's property. And my grass is turning brown, but I'm paying all this money to water the grass. And they're over there, just fine, because their grass is green and nice and beautiful, and mine is rotting away. And so they really don't have a problem. We're the ones with the problem, right? Because we're the ones watering their grass and neglecting our own property. And so therefore, they're irresponsible and happy, and we are responsible and unhappy. So it's really important that you have a sense of what your property lines are and what your neighbor's property lines are, or your sister's property lines are, or your father's property lines, so that you cannot neglect your own property in the trying to take care of theirs. Does that make sense? So you might be thinking, isn't that selfish? To not want to help other people? Well, what are we responsible for? I love to tell people about this because this is a really easy phrase to remember. We are responsible to others, not for others. Two little words that can get us in so much trouble, to and for. We are responsible to others, not for others. We're responsible to love them. We're responsible to care for them. We're responsible to listen to them. We're responsible to show compassion to them. We're even responsible to provide community for them. But we are not responsible for them. We're not responsible for their happiness. We're not responsible for their financial security. We're not responsible for their emotional health. We're not responsible for their daily responsibilities. We hold the key to our happiness alone. We do not hold the key to somebody else's. And for some of you, that is an amazing truth that you don't even realize you're doing. You think you hold the key to another person's happiness when in fact you don't, and the only one you hold is your own. So, what does it mean to not care for somebody else and look at your own property lines as far as what Scripture would have us do? Because many of us don't set boundaries because we think this is something God would want us to do, or in fact, something that Scripture would tell us to do. So let's look at Galatians 6:2, where Paul tells us, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." But 3 verses later it says, "Each man should carry his own load." So those seem to contradict each other a little bit. So let me say that again. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. But each one should carry his own load. Well, if we look at the Greek word behind burden, it means excess burden. It means something you can't carry by yourself. It either requires more energy or resources. You cannot do it alone. And we want to symbolize that with a boulder. It's kind of like a boulder. You can't carry a boulder by yourself, which in fact I made this boulder, so I can in fact carry this boulder. But we're just going to pretend like we can't carry that boulder. And anyway, it's something you can't carry on your own. It's an excessive burden. But when you look at the Greek word for load, when it says each man shall carry his own load, it's talking about the burden of daily toil. It's talking about things like a backpack, daily responsibilities, something you can carry by yourself, something you're expected to carry by yourself. It's your daily cargo or load. And so a boulder would be something like somebody died. They can't carry that on their own. A loved one died. And a backpack would be something like paying my bills. That's the difference between the two. So I want to have a little fun with you guys and do an exercise. And I'm going to call out some of these phrases or words, and I want you guys to yell out to me if you think it is a boulder or a backpack. And I just want to go ahead and let you know, this is hard because you guys are not as familiar with what the difference is between a boulder and a backpack. So still shout it out loud, be proud of yourself, and say it anyway. Okay, so starting off with buying groceries. Is that a boulder or a backpack? Good job. How about if you are a victim of a crime? That's good. How about mental illness? Good. Wow. I'm impressed. How about caring for your family? Mm-hmm. How about abuse? Man, either y'all are all getting this right, or the people that are not sure are not saying anything. Okay, here's a harder one. How about single parenting? There you go. I was waiting for that one. Say it loud and proud. It's a boulder. There are aspects of it that are backpack-ish, but I think our single parents would let you know it is a boulder. How about surgery? Yeah, I guess it depends on the surgery, but let's say if it's plastic surgery, they're on their own, right? But we'll say it's major surgery. How about another's bad mood? Backpack. How about household chores? How about project deadlines? Or your children's schoolwork? That doesn't want to stick. How many of you have done your children's schoolwork, if you have children? Yeah. A loved one dies. Yep. Sickness. Yep. I'll do a few more of these because I think it's really important that you get these. How about your happiness? How about another person's happiness? Mm-hmm. How about another person's emotional health? Mm-hmm. How about an accident? Major accident. Okay. Somebody's house burned down. Natural disaster. You guys get the picture. So if you were hiking and you came upon somebody that was underneath a boulder, you would try to help them, right? But if you came upon somebody and your friend was there and they said, "Will you carry my 50-pound backpack, even though you have your own?" You would think they were crazy, right? Each one should carry his own load. It's biblical. We get confused as to what is somebody's backpack, though, and what is somebody's boulder. And we tend to err on the side of carrying somebody else's backpack than helping them carry their boulder. And even with the boulders, you don't have to choose to help that person with that boulder. I think we are supposed to, but sometimes we have to solicit the help of others to carry the boulder, because sometimes even two of you can't carry it alone. I see this a lot with mental illness, that you have to have a whole group of people surrounding a person with mental illness to be able to help that person with that particular boulder. Does that make sense? So just because it's a boulder doesn't mean you automatically have to be the person right then and there to carry it. Sometimes that's not even the wise thing to do. But you might want to solicit others to then, in fact, help carry that. So we're going to do a little self-check. Okay, we're going to really see if you guys have some boundary issues before I tell you how to set some boundaries. So we're going to do, you might have a boundary problem if. Okay, a little bit of Jeff Foxworthy going on here. You might have a boundary problem if you have a hard time saying no to hurtful people or setting limits on hurtful behavior from others. You might have a boundary problem if you have an inability to say no to things asked of you. You might have a boundary problem if resentment builds in you because you are not appreciated. You might have a boundary problem if you have an inability to say no to yourself, i.e. addictions, your own destructive impulses, maybe even working too much, eating too much, doing too much Pinterest, not for you guys, of course, TV, Facebook, sometimes even exercise. You might have a boundary problem if you have an inability to hear no from others and to respect their limits. Sometimes controlling people have boundary problems. You might have a boundary problem if you have a tendency to be attracted to irresponsible or hurtful people and then try to fix them. You might have a boundary problem if you have a tendency to take responsibility for other people's lives, especially your children, your spouse, your boss, your family. A lot of people struggle with taking responsibility for their bosses. We tend to not talk about that one too much, but it's true. For their happiness, their household responsibilities, and even sometimes their schoolwork, like I said. You might have a boundary problem if you have an inability to be honest with those that are close to you. You might have a boundary problem if you have an inability to confront others and resolve conflict productively. You might have a boundary problem if you blame others for circumstances in your life and experience life with a victim mindset. And you might have a boundary problem if your bosses or coworkers have you doing way more than what's on your job description, and you care way more about their affirmation than you should. Those are just a few. So you're thinking to yourself, okay, I definitely qualified for at least one of those phrases. So what in the world is the harm in that? And the reality is, if you carry somebody else's load, you are going to burden yourself because you were only meant to carry a certain load. And it's kind of like a levee. You know, in Louisiana, New Orleans is underwater. It's below sea level. And so they built this levee so that when a storm would come or a hurricane would come, that water wouldn't flood the city of New Orleans. And as many of you know, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina came about and did in fact flood the city of New Orleans. And so that levee broke. That levee was meant to carry a certain load and no more. And so when the storms come and that levee's doing its job to try to hold back the waters from flooding, when a storm comes, it can't bear that load. It's more than it can handle. So the levee breaches, it causes flooding, it causes havoc and destruction. Well, boundaries are levees in our lives. You guys were meant to carry a certain load. You cannot carry somebody's boulder for them. You cannot carry, like I said, by yourself. You cannot carry your backpack in addition to somebody else's backpack without you neglecting your own property. And what will happen is you'll get burned out, you'll get tired, you'll get cranky. Like I said earlier, you'll get depressed, you'll get anxious, you'll get resentful, and sometimes you'll even hate another person. When in fact, when you're not setting boundaries, the person that you should be mad at is yourself. Because remember, we set boundaries for us, not for another person. So if somebody is treating you poorly, or somebody is taking advantage of you, or somebody is not appreciating you, you are allowing that to happen by not setting a boundary for that person. Does that make sense? But you're not only hurting yourself, you're hurting the other person as well. And the reason you're hurting the other person is because they are not able to experience the pain of consequences that can motivate them to change. We see this all the time with individuals that have addictions. Their family members oftentimes will make excuses for them. The boss might call and say, hey, you know, where is such and such? And the mom, the sister, the spouse will cover for them because they don't want their loved one to experience pain and they don't want them to lose their job. That would really be a bad situation. But what's happening is you're not allowing that person to experience the pain of their consequences, so therefore there's really not much reason to change. Not that that's the only reason a person has an addiction, but it's certainly not helping to be an enabler of that addiction. We do this with all kinds of things. We do it with our kids' schoolwork. We do it with other people's jobs. We do it all the time, and what we're not realizing is we're not helping that person out because they're not experiencing the pain of that consequence to be motivated to change. And so the addict is not the only one with the problem. The enabler also has the problem, and we would love to talk to you guys further about that if that is a situation that's in your life. So, saying no to others many times is the most loving thing that you can do. We see this in a book called Toxic Charity. It's also in another book called Codependent No More. Sometimes saying no to another person and letting them carry their own load, even if they're homeless, is giving them the dignity and the integrity that they really deserve and they also need. I encourage you to read either one of those books to find out more about it. God does not enable irresponsible behavior, as you can see in Proverbs 16:26. And in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, it says, if anyone will not work, don't let him eat. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. And that's a rule that they encouraged everybody to live by back then. So a lot of times to figure out, do I have a boundary issue, I will ask myself, do I care about somebody else's life more than they care about their own? I'll repeat that. Do I care about somebody else's life more than they care about their own? If the answer is yes, you more than likely have to step away and set a boundary. But beware, because if you set boundaries, it does not always cause great reactions in other people, especially if you're not good at it or you're not used to doing it. A lot of times you will get the following reactions. You will get anger from other people because they're like, what in the world? She's never done this before, or he's never done this before. They'll blame you. They like to try to make you feel guilty. They're very unforgiving. Some will stop talking to you. I have a friend who used to give money to her sister on a regular basis, and she's married. Her sister was married, and but she was giving to her sister very generously, but decided at one point that that was no longer financially feasible, nor did she think it was financially responsible to continue to do so. So she let her sister know that she was not going to be able to do that anymore, which led to much anger and discontinuation of communication for years. This is the kind of reaction you will get from somebody that expects you not to set boundaries and expects you to carry your own load, which was very, very disheartening to this person because they were loving them and giving to them every month, and they were unappreciated for it, and it was extremely unhealthy. So who do we need to set boundaries with for ourselves, by the way? And it's pretty much everybody. It can be your children, your boss, your coworker, your friend, your spouse, your mom, your dad, pretty much everyone. Different relationships require different boundaries, but pretty much everyone we need to set boundaries with, letting them know, I want to be treated a certain way, and I will not be treated a certain way. And it's not with an attitude like, I will not be treated this way. It's more of a, I'm taking care of myself, I'm carrying my own load, and this is how you can treat me, and this is how you can't treat me. And if you treat me this way, then I'm going to have to do this. And we'll learn about that in a second on how to set boundaries. So let's figure out, how do we set boundaries? Well, first of all, the very first thing you got to do is recognize 3 things, okay? This is before we start setting the boundaries. The very first thing you got to recognize is what is the difference between a boulder and a backpack. As you look at your life and you see frustrating situations and you start to encounter, man, this is really bothering me or this is really irritating me, ask yourself, is this a boulder or is this a backpack? Is this person wanting me to carry their backpack? It's really important that you recognize that. And sometimes you need the help of a counselor to be able to determine the difference, especially if you're entrenched in this boundary problem. You might need the help of a counselor. Some of you can just reach out to a friend and get their advice and say, hey, is this a boundary, or do you think I mean, is this a boulder or do you think this is a backpack? And they can help you do that. We can be so much more objective to each other than we can be to ourselves. Okay, the next thing you want to recognize is yourself. You want to get to know yourself. What are positive ways you want to be treated? What are negative ways you do not want to be treated? What do you want from your job? What do you not want from your job? What do you want from this relationship? And like I said, this is not an entitlement. This is more what is important and how is it important that I am treated as a child of God rather than being taken advantage of, mistreated, and so forth. The third thing you want to recognize is the difference between false guilt and real guilt. Because so many people will try to make you feel guilty for not, or for setting boundaries in their life. So you got to know the difference. And so real guilt is when you have sinned against somebody and you feel guilt as a conviction of your sin. False guilt is any other type of guilt. If you feel guilty and you know you have not sinned, then you are experiencing what I call false guilt. And so it's really important that you know the difference between those two. The next thing you're going to want to do before you start setting boundaries is to recharge. Okay? Take time away from others to recharge. Many times your situation is so enmeshed with your family or so in such bad shape where it needs boundaries set like crazy. You have got to take a break. It doesn't mean a permanent break. You've got to take a break. You've got to do what Jesus did when he took breaks from the crowds and walked away. In Proverbs 22:3, it says, "The prudent man sees evil and hides himself." So it's even biblical to do that. If you don't do this, I promise you, you will get burned out and you won't be able to do it anyway. So you might as well make an intentional choice to recharge before you start setting these boundaries. And then the next thing I want to say is pretty important. Do not take on more activities than you can handle. If you have 5 different extracurricular activities, a full-time job, and you're doing all these different things and you can't catch your breath, that's not taking time to recharge. My rule of thumb, if you have children, is let them be involved in one activity at a time. If you have 4 children, that's 4 activities, so that's tough. But, like I had 4 children. But let only one activity at a time. If it's you, I would suggest 1 extracurricular activity at a time and maybe 2 non-job related activities going on during your job. Does that make sense? So that's just a rule of thumb. You can make your own. But we try to pile on way too many activities and it causes us to be burned out. All right, so now we're ready to set boundaries. You want to make sure that you're setting boundaries as upfront as you can from the very beginning. And this is not always possible, but when you can, set those boundaries from the beginning as you go along and then follow up as you finish. Does that make sense? And I gave you guys an example here of a statement that you could use. You wouldn't want to use this in every situation, so you sound robotic, but it's just a good example to try. If you do not blank, then I will no longer be able to make myself available to you for blank. We are not telling them what they can or cannot do. Please be clear. Boundaries are for you. We are just telling them how we will respond if they don't accept the boundary that we've stated. Does that make sense? So an example of this would be, if you don't talk to me calmly, I will no longer be able to stay on the phone. My mom and I had a tumultuous relationship. She has Alzheimer's disease now, so it's much different. But she had borderline personality disorder, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's pretty rough. So there were many times that I've had to learn how to set boundaries with my family. We had a very enmeshed family, and the reason I'm a boundaries queen, as Amy mentioned, is because I've had to practice so many boundaries, and most of them have been with my mom or my siblings. And so there were many times when I would be on the phone with my mom, and she would start yelling, or she would start, arguing over the phone, and I would say, okay, well, I'm going to have to let you go unless we can have a productive conversation. And it sounds superior, but it really was trying to be productive. Let's take a break from this conversation and come back and talk about this when we can talk about it calmly, because I don't want to say anything I'm going to regret, and I don't want us to hurt one another. Now, that did not make her happy by any stretch of the imagination, but it was me setting a boundary that I'm not going to be talked to this way. This is getting me stressed out. It's getting me anxious, and it's causing me to want to yell back at you, feeling attacked. So the best thing I could do was, if you talk to me this way, I'm going to have to hang up the phone. Does that make sense? We'll talk about a few more examples in a minute. The next thing is practice saying no. For those of you that have a really hard time saying no to things, practice with small things. Practice saying no to minor things, like volunteering for not one of these ministries, of course. I'd get in big trouble if I said that. But I'm talking about like helping out at a charity or something. If you've got all these activities going on, practice with small things. You'll get more comfortable with it. Saying no is actually one of the most honest things you can do with somebody. The Bible says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Not being able to say no is oftentimes dishonest, because you're feeling it inside, but you're saying yes to the person, and you're taking on all the stuff, and you keep saying yes, and it's really just hurting everybody. It's funny. You don't have to be rude about it, though. And I chuckled when I saw in one of your surveys, somebody put, and it was a cute saying, say what you mean, but don't say it mean. You don't have to be rude. And for some of you that are really have a hard time setting boundaries, you're going to tend to go the opposite direction and just be rude about it. Like, no, I'm not doing this. And it's because you're not used to setting boundaries. So don't go to the opposite extreme and get really mean, because you're really going to freak people out, because they're not going to know what's coming. Okay, so what do we do if somebody doesn't respect our boundaries or they violate our boundaries? If you guys will do this seems so simple, but it really can make a difference, okay? The first thing I want you to do is make a list of the people that are violating your boundaries. So simple. Make a list. Ask yourself these questions. Number 1, did I clearly state my boundaries to this person? Does this person know how I want to be treated and how I don't want to be treated, what I expect and what I don't expect from this person? Did you state the boundaries clearly? If you didn't, then you need to do that. Second question, am I enabling their irresponsible behavior by carrying their backpack? Am I noticing, hey, I'm pretty much willing to carry their backpack, so that's something I've got to stop doing. So that's number 2. And then number 3 question you want to ask yourself about this list of people is, are they chronics? And chronics are a group of people that John Townsend, who wrote the book Boundaries, refers to that are in one crisis after another. And we all know people like this. My mom was one of these people that it seemed like she had one boulder after another. But what I realized is crisis was attracted to her, and she would get herself in these situations over and over and over. And it became where I was enabling her irresponsible behavior, even by things that looked like a boulder. So ask yourself, is this person a chronic? Do they tend to have one problem after another? When they ignore your no, you gotta follow through with your response. Remember how the definition was that we will respond with behavior if they don't, accept our rules and limits? You gotta follow through, or you can forget it. It will not work. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The statement is, if you do not blank, then I will no longer be able to blank. Okay? If you do not stop treating me this way, then I will need to leave. Okay? If you continue to talk to me this way, I'm going to have to hang up the phone. That's the one I used all the time. If you continue to give me more work than I am able to handle, then I'm going to have to prioritize the work you give me, and not all of it is going to be able to get done. If you continue to abuse me, I'm going to have to ask you to leave, or I'm going to leave. These seem like simple statements. They're so hard to follow through on, and that is the most important part of setting boundaries, is you got to follow through with what you say you're going to do, or it won't make any difference. You'll do all this work, and it won't make any difference. And we all want to work on this together, and I want you guys to be able to lean into each other and be able to find out from one another how we can set boundaries. And so I really, really encourage you guys to do that. I want to tell you one more story about my family, kind of funny, but it was when I first had to start setting boundaries. My parents lived about 45 minutes away from my husband and I's house, and like I told you, we had 4 kids. And so they would just show up at our house without any notice and want to come see us and the kids. And I realized, this was causing an issue because we weren't having any notice, and it was disrupting our family time and so forth and so on. So, of course, I mentioned to my mom, hey, I need for you guys to call first just to make sure we're home. Make sure that you don't drive 45 minutes over here and then we're not home. And so I was working with a counselor at the time, and she said to me, you're going to have to follow through with this. Like, if they come over to your house and haven't called first, you're going to have a plan as to where you're going to go. So my husband and I came up with this plan that if this happened, which we thought surely it won't happen because we've brought it up to her. And anyway, so we came up with this plan that if they showed up, that we would load all 4 kids in the car and just say, sorry, we had plans, and then drive off. And we had our plans all, set and everything. Sure enough, my parents pull in the driveway, and I'm like, oh my gosh, here they are. We got to get ready with the plan. And we're like in the middle of making dinner or something. It was really disruptive to have to do this. But I knew you have to follow through with it, or it just is not going to work. So my husband's a people pleaser, so it was really upsetting to him. He's like, no, let's just wait and tell him again. I'm like, no, we got to do this. So they come to the door, and we're like, we're so sorry you came all the way over here. We have plans, and we're leaving. And so we get all the kids, and for those of you that have kids, know how hard this is. You walk out the door, and they're just literally doing like this, stand on the front porch, looking at us, get in our car, and drive off. Well, let me tell you something. It never happened again. Never. And what's funny is for whoever put in their survey that their mom says boundaries, schmoundaries, my mom would call and say, well, I know you want me to call first before we come over, so is it okay for us to come over? She was very disrespectful, did not like that we set the boundaries. But weirdly enough, it really allowed us to have probably the most respect out of everybody in our whole entire family. My sister would be like, how come Mom respects you so much? Or, my brother too. And it's like, because I set boundaries, I'm considered the harsh one, So you got to follow through on that, I promise. From the phone conversations to, and for some of you, you've got this way worse. You've got abuse going on and addictions going on in your families. And so you really got to figure out how to follow through with some of the setting of boundaries, or it is not going to work. All right, so how not to set boundaries? First of all, don't go radio silent. Don't avoid people so that you don't have to set boundaries. A lot of people do that. It's like, oh, I'll just avoid them, and then I never have to set them. Don't be too rigid with your boundaries. We've noticed men are often really rigid with their boundaries to the point where they're guarded and don't share themselves with others. And so you don't want to be too rigid with them. And so I just want to close with thanking you so much for your time. I want to make sure you guys have learned what the difference is between a boulder and a backpack. I want you guys to remember what it means to be responsible to somebody and not for somebody. And I want you guys to experience a lot of freedom and a lot of respect from other people. Can you imagine a world where we set boundaries and we feel good and we help others because we choose to help others, and we feel altruism instead of resentment or even hatred for another person, or we get respect from other people, or we don't experience anxiety or depression as a result of that? Wouldn't that be an awesome world? I really do think if we could learn to set some boundaries, the majority of our problems would disappear. Let me pray with you guys, and then we're going to do some case studies. Dear Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for this group of people. I thank you for these leaders. Their lives are just so important, and they have so much to give. And I know that if we don't set boundaries, which is in your word, it's biblical, that we won't be able to give to others, and we won't be able to glorify you in the process and be able to minister to others. So I pray specifically for each person here that they learn how to set boundaries so that they can be the best tool that you can use with everyone and ministering to others, and they can experience the full life that you have come that they might experience. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.